Welcome, everybody, to the Troubadour podcast. Today I'm going to cover a poem and a poet that I have yet to cover on this show. And I've done it deliberately, but he's a poet that you know, and his name is William Shakespeare. And I haven't covered him because I believe there are so many different feelings about him, positive and negative, and fears sometimes for those of us who are not familiar with poetry in approaching William Shakespeare. So I'm going to cover one of his sonnets. Now, his sonnets are 14 lines, very short, but we have to remember when we're approaching any poetry that is old or classical, but particularly with William Shakespeare, we have to take into consideration the separation of time and what language changes over time. So we're reading Shakespeare in 2020 now, and it's written in the 1500s. So there's going to be not only a usage of language, but also sometimes words that are not just the these and the thous and such, but literally when he's talking about an idiot, it's not the same way that we use the term idiot. The term has changed. And there's different ways, even a word like lines, which is in this poem. When William Shakespeare uses the word lines, he does mean, lines on a page, maybe one line, but it was also a term used for ropes. And the lines that would tie a ship to the shore, and lines that connect people. And there may be multiple usage of that you would encounter in his time that we wouldn't really quite use in the same way today. And that can be a little bit of a challenge in approaching Shakespeare, just the separation of time. But I do think he is one of the better poets he's obviously one of the great poets, but one of the poets that really can show us the shape and form and purpose that poetry can have and that it should have, and what it does as an art form. So we're going to cover Sonnet 18 today, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And you may have heard of that, and you may not even know that it came from William Shakespeare. Before I do that, though, there is one analogy of poetry that I want to explain in order to help you see what poetry is and its value and its intrigue, and why some people are so passionate about it and some people seem to not really care. And you can go a whole lifetime without ever reading or thinking about poetry. Now, whether it's the best lifetime you can have, I'd argue not, but that's a conversation for another time. But for now, what I want to bring up is something from the 90s called magic eye illusions. Have you ever seen these? If you're on Facebook, I'm going to take my face off this thing. If you're on Facebook or YouTube and you're watching this, you'll see a whole bunch of colorful little dots and figures, or just like dots and circles, but millions of them or tens of thousands of them covering your screen. Now, magic eye illusions in the 90s in particular, it was, I was born in 85. So this was a big fad for any 90s kid. We all know what I'm talking about here. It's magic eye illusion. It would be like a big poster in an office or at a mall, and you could buy books of them. And what happens is you look at the image for long enough and you stare at it. And there's actually a technique you're supposed to bring, according to the makers of these things, you're supposed to bring the image as close to your nose as possible, unfocus your eyes, and then after a few seconds, you're supposed to pull back slowly. And there's other techniques of, looking off into the distance. You want to look for certain cubes that'll pop up. Focus above the cube. When you see 3 cubes, that's good. You want to back up, you'll see the image. And then once you see the image, you want to start looking around the rest of the picture to bring out the image in more stark contrast. Now, the point of that is that what is happening is, I'm not going to get into the physiology of how our optics work. I don't know that much about it. But the analogy is that there is this process and there is this thing where what you're looking at is just blurs on a piece of paper. That's it. That's what you're looking at on these magic eye illusions. And with these magic eye, and I like the title that they chose, which isn't the technical title. I think it was like stereogram or astiogram or something like that. And it was basically taking a 2D image and making it a 3D image and superimposing two different images in order to, the way that our eyes optically will take two, because we have two eyes and they're superimposing, and there's some process optically that I'm not familiar with. But the magic eyes illusion that I like about it, the concept and the analogy or the metaphor when it comes to poetry, is that what you're getting is you're seeing this blur that makes no sense, and there's no image, there's no meaning, there's no clarity, there's no there. It's just blobs on a page, or blobs on a poster board. But when you look at it and you spend time with it, and you, in this case, it's kind of an automatic process with the magic eye illusion, but eventually you start to reveal a little bit of this image. Now, interestingly, not everybody can see it, or it's very difficult for some people, particularly people like me with bad eyesight. And that's something special to this magic eye illusion. But most people, I think, can see it after a while. It maybe takes some time, but a lot, the good amount of people can see it. I definitely saw it when I was a kid. I do have more trouble seeing it now that I'm, 34. And I have bad eyesight, of course. But it's similar to poetry in that what I want to get across is that when you look at these magic eye illusions, it is absolutely meaningless nonsense in the most literal term that it is. It's meaningless nonsense, and it's meant to be meaningless nonsense. And through a process, in this case, an optical, structure that you would do in terms of putting your nose, unfocus your eye, going back, and understanding how your eyes work. And in that process, you start to uncover the meaning, the image that's within the magic eye illusion. And that is the same process, but on a more purposeful level with poetry. With poetry, you are you are going to be looking at an image or at a scratching of words on a page that is going to make almost no sense. And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you'll see what I'm talking about now. You'll see the poem on the screen. And if not, go to troubadourmag.com and you can check out the image there. Or you can check out the poem there. But it's a very short poem, and I'm going to read it, and then we'll go through it line by line. Again, it's only 14 lines. It's very short, and there's a shape to it. And that's what I want to get across as we're discussing this, is that there's a process that, now this is more of a mental exercise process than the optical illusion, than the magic eye illusion. The analogy stops in the automatic point. So with the magic eye illusion, there's a kind of mostly inner optimization or automation that happens in terms of how you see the image. With poetry, you have to do the work yourself. You have to do the unlocking. The process is more conceptual, therefore it has more of an active, you have to ask questions, you have to look up the definition of words, you have to know the meat of language a little bit. And if you don't, that's okay. You'll only see a vague picture at first, and as you get better with language and life and literature and experiences in life, you'll understand the picture much, much more clearly. Now, we're going to go into what the theme of this particular poem is. And what I hope that you'll gain from this is not only an understanding of this particular poem, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, but again, the essence of what art can do and what poetry is all about, and why it is of value to every single person who happens to be a human being. So if you're a human, my argument has always been that art is essential to being a human being. It's not something that is superfluous, that's nice. And in particular, literature plays a very, very special role, poetry is one aspect of literature that is very, very critical. And one of my arguments at the moment is the shape of poetry, and that it's through this process I've been talking about that meaning in general starts to happen in your life. And this is true. And in the case of poetry, what's unique about poetry is that it uses only words versus something like painting that uses paints, colors, and paintbrushes and such, but the medium is color and images on a some type of surface. What poetry uses is the language is language itself, and language is what we build everything in our society and in ourselves on. Everything is built on language. It's the most important part of being a human, I would argue, in terms of, and especially, it's the thing that we know separates us from the animals is our ability to speak. But speaking isn't some automatic thing. There are levels to it in terms of what we can do. And with language. And what's interesting about poetry and why I think it's so worthy of study in and of itself versus prose literature is that it is clearly the most artificial of all literature. It is the most affected. We know that this isn't how we talk. Even in the 1500s when Shakespeare is writing this, he is baffling people back then. Even back then, they weren't, clear. So think about separating it by 500 years. There was an ambivalence, a difficulty, a misunderstanding, or a purposeful confusion that's going on sometimes. And that's part of what poetry is all about. It's because most important things in life are like that. There are only mild explanations or partial explanations that you can never fully get the total picture. So, the easy example is when you ask somebody, that seems like a simple yes or no question, like, do you love me? And they say yes, that is somewhat unsatisfying. It's not the full picture. What does that mean? How does it manifest itself? And, you feel good in that moment, but then you walk away and you start to think about it. And so in other words, there's a whole vastness to that whole concept of whether someone loves you or not. And, we know that there's spectrums. It's like, well, yes, I love you, but I'm actually more in love with this other person, right? So it's like there's all these spectrums, and it's a very vague and complicated and deep idea of what that means to love somebody or to be loved by somebody. And that is what poetry is kind of replicating and illustrating and manifesting and showing you, is that in unlocking this image that you're going to see with with Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, is going to be a full image, but not a full image. And the shape that it takes is going to be the totality of the poem, but it's also going to be something that's in you and that you have to kind of shape yourself. And that's the kind of magic illusion of poetry, is that there's the language on the page, but then there's also, you have to go inside and fill in some of the meanings that are going in with your own understanding of it. So often the best that I can do for you in these, poetry discussions is help give you some guidance on this. But if you don't read it for yourself, it's not going to make sense, and it's not going to help you much. So, at this point with many Shakespeare poems, for instance, when I hear them read, I actually can understand them, but that's only because I've read them dozens and dozens of times. And, one of my goals is not that you would read all these poems as many times as I do, because that's not your full-time job or anything, but that you find a couple poems that speak to you, or that speaks to a moment that's important to you, and that you print out, you put it on, a board for a while, and you read it every day. And I promise you, just like the magic eye illusion, the more you look at it, the more shape it will take. And this will not only mean something to you, but it shapes your own life. This is what we do in life when we're, in advertising, it's all about the shape. When we watch movies, when we talk to somebody and try and convey a story to somebody at a party, we wonder why people don't understand what we're talking about. It's because you're your stories don't have a shape to them. They don't make any sense and people can't follow you. And that's part of, what you can learn and experience from poetry as well, is how to bring out shapes in the ideas, thoughts, and activity of your life. So let's bring out the shape and the form and the meaning of this poem, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So I'm going to read it once. Please remember that just like the magic eye illusion, it's going to make no sense. And that's good. That's the way it's supposed to be, just like the magic eye illusion. And then we're going to go through it line by line. It's only 14 lines. So we'll go through it and kind of, I'll kind of guide you through it. And you may have other understandings that you're going to get from it as well, outside of what I say. Okay. Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So what are we talking about here? What's this guy talking about? Well, we should understand at least one value of classic poetry is that we should understand that there's something he's trying to communicate. That's one difference that you can rely on for poetry done 100 years ago or before, something that has gone into the canon, that it's been analyzed and assessed and loved and appreciated by generation after generation. One thing you can rely on is the fact that it likely does have some profound meaning in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have passed so many hands for so many decades. Whereas today, and this is why I have a problem with contemporary poetry, is sometimes it's hard to, commit to reading it, and then you really analyze it and you find out that there's not really anything going on behind those doors. There's no image behind the blobs of paint, right? It's just blobs of paint. With the magic eye illusion, you can know, well, this is actually a scientifically computer designed, algorithm that they did to make this perfect. And we know that there's something behind it. And so it's worth to put, stand there for 30 minutes and try to make this image come to life. But that's not the case with contemporary poetry a lot of times, which is one of my difficulties with it. But you can rely on that with classic poetry, especially with someone like Shakespeare. So we're going to trust in Shakespeare a little bit. We're going to trust in the classical thing, that there's something interesting here, maybe even very profound, especially if this is considered one of the most famous poems. So let's think about what we're looking at here. So the first thing we're doing is we're trying to take everything seriously. And he's asking a question. So why would we not take his first question as a question, right? Because he's asking, and we might ask, like, well, who is he talking to? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Well, he's possibly asking something to a woman. I mean, that would probably make the most sense, right? This seems like a love poem. You could say it's, he's homosexual, it's to a man, and he's trying to say how beautiful the man is. That's fine. But what we're going to think is that this is probably about a beautiful woman. And he's saying, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And I'm going to give you one historical hint that you don't have to know, but I think it's nice to know. One of the proverbs in Shakespeare's time is that there is nothing or as beautiful as a summer's day. And so they would, basically the idea was, oh, this is as beautiful as a summer's day, or she's as beautiful as a summer's day. But the implication that they had was that the summer's day was the pinnacle of beauty, that there was a part of a summer day that was the pinnacle, that this is the height that you could achieve in beauty. And Shakespeare is going to make an argument here, And this is an argument, like an actual philosophical, thought out. He's going to say, here's my case, Your Honor, argument that the woman is going to be more beautiful than a summer's day. And he's asking this question, well, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And he says, thou art, you are more lovely and more temperate. So right off the bat, he's saying, you're more lovely than a summer's day. You're more beautiful than a summer's day. And you're more temperate. Now, this is interesting. And we're going to go back to several meanings, but this is one word that even though you know what the word means, it bears looking up the definition. Now, one of the meanings is temperature, right? But it also, temperate means mild temperature. So he's starting to argue, and he's making the case that she's not only beautiful, but part of her beauty is the calmness, the mildness. It's not over the top. It's not too crazy. It's a kind of temperate, mild love or beauty. Now, keep this next meaning for temperate in mind. Comes from the Latin, and if you know the Latin root, for time. So we have something about time here. And I'm just going to let you know the one way to unlock this poem as we read it through is that time is going to be very important. We're going to see this a couple of times. So here comes another one in a few lines, but let's go to the next line. So right now he's compared her to, he's asked her, shall I compare these? Like, here, I have a challenge. Here's my case. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You got comparison, woman, summer's day. Well, he says right off the bat, you're more lovely and more calming and mild in a good way. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So we're back into that time theme, right? So now he's saying something negative about summer, right? So first he starts off by saying she's more beautiful than summer. And now he's going to say, well, here's some negative things about summer. Summer may have some beautiful days, perhaps, but there's also rough winds that do shake the darling buds of May, right? So summer comes in as kind of like a bulldog or a bulldozer or a bull and just kind of knocks everything over, destroys everything. And he says, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. I mean, that word lease is a real estate term. It's a term of temporariness, that you're not permanent, right? Summer's not permanent. So here's an interesting question that should pop into your head if you're reading this slowly and thinking about it. Well, how on earth is he going to make the case that her beauty is permanent? Because we know that beauty fades, right? Well, I don't know. Shakespeare might be arguing something different with that, because he's making the argument now, summer's lease hath all too short a date. Okay, so summer is only there for the 3 months and then it's gone after it like shakes up the darling buds of May. And so what does that mean about her beauty though? Well, he's going to go into some more negatives. So before we get to her, which she's more beautiful and lovely, and he's already set her up that way, let's look into the next couple lines. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. Okay, so what is the eye of heaven, do you think? I mean, think about it. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. I mean, what's in the heavens? The sun, right? And so he's basically just saying sometimes it's too damn hot, right? Like sometimes summer, and it is like, I'm in the Bay Area and it's going to be 100 degrees, but I've also lived in Texas where, the summers get super hot. We're talking triple digits on a regular basis. And then of course with humidity, it's insane. So summer can get too hot and it can be too uncomfortable and you don't want to be there. And it's just gross just to be outside. Right? Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So what does that mean? His gold complexion dimmed. What can dim his complexion? Like clouds, right? So Shakespeare is starting to make this argument. Well, summer's not all that it's made up to be, right? This is one thing you can do in a court case is you can build a positive case for something, but you can also knock down your opposition. Say, well, they're witnesses are not reliable. We can't use their witnesses. That piece of evidence was, brought into the system improperly, and we can't rely on that. So we have to toss that out, right? And that's basically what he's doing here. He's like checking off these negatives about summer. Summer's not the most beautiful thing. It's not. Everyone's wrong in that proverb. That's as beautiful, or it's almost as beautiful as a summer's day. Like no. He's saying Yeah, there may be beauty in summer, but sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dim. So you only get that moment, it's gone, right? He's building a case that summer's not all it's cracked up to be, right? Because he's trying to compare his lover to a summer's day. And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Now, often when he uses the term fair, by the way, he means a fair face. And so he is saying that, and every face or beautiful face, not just any face, a fair, beautiful, like the fair Helen of Troy, sometimes decline by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. So this is an interesting segue here, because he's saying in a sense that beauty does fade, right? And every fair from fair sometime declines, sometime it does at some point in time. So there's that time metaphor that he's been building up. And so we're getting this thing with time in the background. This is kind of the image that's underneath all of this that maybe is helpful in unlocking the poem. Is there's something about time. And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. So he says, but you, my love, will not fade. And so now we should be thinking, okay, so he is saying that, yeah, most women or most beauty does fade. Even the beauty of nature, even the beauty of summer, all of that fades. But her eternal summer shall not fade. How is his particular lover, whoever this lover may be, how is it that she will not fade, or her beauty will not fade like everybody else's? And like summer, there's something odd. What's this guy doing? What's he up to? What argument could he possibly make? Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, or owns, like what you own. So you're not going to lose possession of it either. It's going to be there, and it's always yours, and it'll be there forever. So he's making one hell of a claim here. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou grow, right? So he's also saying you will not, even after death, it cannot overshadow your beauty. It won't overshadow your beauty. So even death itself won't overtake your beauty. And this is where we get these magic two lines, or if you're looking at the poem itself, it's indented, and we're looking at it, and this is his answer to all of the questions and all of the claims that he's been making. And before this, the last line I just read, I'm going to reread again. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. So he's making the claim that that through time she's going to grow in this sense. Her beauty will grow in eternal lines. So if we think about lines as these lines of these poetry, now we're starting to see that's how he's making his claim. And he's going to kind of follow up and conclude with this answer. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now that's a hell of a statement. And the theme of this poem, I would say, is the glory of poetry. In fact, or one way to think about it is to the glory of poetry. Because what he is essentially saying here is that because of his art has captured her beauty in this poem, in the rhythm, the rhyme, she is the image embedded behind the globs of paint, behind the eternal lines, that if you look deep, there is and there lies her beauty, because it inspired him perhaps. That it and she will forever exist. Even though she herself, the mortal, vessel, will perish, her spirit and her beauty is enraptured in locked up in this poem. And so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. He has bestowed immortality upon her beauty. And so all the things he was talking about with time and beauty is that he's making the argument that he, in using her as the image of his inspiration has immortalized her for all of time. And that is how she has gained the power through him as the medium for beating back the sun, the summer, and the beauty of the summer. And this is how she wins, in a sense, is she is the one who encompasses beauty eternally in this poem. Okay, so since we were able to do this quite quickly and to give you a sense of it, I'm going to read it one more time because it's so short. So I'm going to read it again. You know, if you need to pause to take a break, great. It'll only take a few seconds and then I'll wrap up. But I think in listening to it again, you can get a deeper sense of it. And actually, I want one quick thing about poetry to kind of wrap up my earlier conversation. This poem takes shape only after reading it several times. As I always say, poetry is not meant to be read, it's meant to be reread. Robert Frost had a great saying that poetry is like a piece of ice on a hot skillet. It must ride on its own meaning. In other words, so picture that for a second, a piece of ice on a hot skillet and it kind of glides around. That's the meaning that comes out of it. And it sizzles like that, but it has to be done through you looking into it and, you know, really doing the work. It's not an automatic process. That's the big difference between the magic eye illusion, is that the magic eye illusion, you could basically just like stare at it, move back and forth, and it would pop into your eyes automatically. You have to do the work in poetry. You have to individually untangle it and kind of do it through reading it and rereading it and rereading it and looking up words and rereading it and rereading it and rereading it. You got to do that. And if you don't, you're missing out so much of the value of what poetry and art can do in unlocking and in helping you shape your life. This is something we do all the time. When you write a resume or a CV, that is shaping your life. You're saying that these 5 events in 35 years, that is what's most important in your life. You know, when you talk to somebody and they say, hey, tell me a little about yourself. You're not telling them every detail from birth on up, right, to today. You're using words to give shape to your life. Poetry helps you do that. It helps you. This helps you when you're talking to loved ones. It helps you when you're thinking to yourself of who am I? Like, what kind of person am I really as you get older is a question you might think of. And where do I want to go? And this is something that poetry helps you do by training you to do it. Okay. And I'll just, the last word and then I'll read it. And then that'll be it for today's episode. And I'll just end with that. And I'll say that one tool that it uses of many tools like rhythm and rhyme and meter, which this has, you know, beautiful structure. This is a tight, that's why I use this poem, because it's so tight. The structure of it's tight. It's a sonnet. There's a particular way of writing it that you have to have the certain right amount of syllables and the right kind of rhyme scheme and everything. But one of the major tools is comparison, which is what this poem does. It compares a woman to a summer's day. And he's going to use all the language and all the tools of language that he can and muster them and organize them in such a way as to help create meaning in the mind of the reader. Okay, so I'm going to read it one more time and then I'll sign off right after that. So thank you guys for listening. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growst. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.